Near midnight, above an unmarked basin where two borders argue only with wind, a white bloom opened over the sand. It was not hot, not jagged, not the kind of light that shouts. It held steady, moon-pale and deliberate, while dogs stayed quiet, and a shepherd watched his breath go unwarmed. Satellites logged brightness. Thermal bands logged nothing. After 11 minutes, the glow thinned to a thread and went out without smoke, ash, or a scorch the size of a coin. The desert resumed its older silence, the guarded kind that listens back. By morning, the paperwork was modest. An untitled brief, a coordinate, a window. Weather stations submitted ordinary numbers. Analysts wrote that nothing unusual had occurred. Because it was neither weather nor war, it slid into the drawer both sides use for events that prefer the dark. A file received a name designed not to echo, Operation Silent Flame. It sounded like a riddle told carefully to itself. Orders arrived in their everyday uniform. Verify reported thermal anomaly. Secure site, recover debris if present. An engineering detail was assembled from men who built bridges and cleared roads, men accustomed to objects that admit what they weigh. Lieutenant Kaminsky read the dispatch twice and then again aloud, weighing each syllable the way a sapper weighs a step. No mention of fire, no mention of light, only a grid, a time, and the promise that science would meet them there with patient eyes. They moved at dusk in a convoy small enough to be forgotten without offense. The road looked rehearsed. A single dark line whispered into the open. The sun folded into the horizon. Heat bled away so quickly the windows fogged from inside. Thermometers behaved as if examined. On the intercom, low voices kept a stranger at the edge of thought. Coffee. Leave days. A truck that starts on the second try. A map lay on Kaminsky's knee, held flat by a gloved hand that preferred facts to hope. The grid square announced itself by refusing to appear. From every angle it was ordinary. A shallow bowl of sand with a fringe of stone, the kind of place wind forgets. As the first truck eased down, night adjusted its posture. Tire noise thickened and then fell away. Beyond the headlights lay a colour the lamps could not wake. Kaminsky told the driver to idle. He stepped into air that felt like the inside of a chapel after the door has closed. Cool, attentive, undecided. Instruments behaved, then declined. Handheld heat sensors stared into the basin and returned a perfect zero, an arithmetic nothing given too quickly to trust. A corporal tapped his screen and frowned at obedience. Then, as if on a hidden dimmer, a white pulse lifted, patient and indifferent to the cold it did not change. It rose and settled as if time had decided to breathe slower. They walked toward it in a thin line, carrying the kind of quiet that makes radios whisper back. The glow kept its bowl of milk shape. There was no smell, no crackle, no smoke. Kaminsky pushed his hand through the edge and felt nothing at all, which is different from feeling cold. His glove darkened to a soft mat that looked like ash but would not smear. A sergeant counted under his breath as though timing waves. Someone noted their shadows had not moved since arrival. Procedure offered a handhold. Cones marked a perimeter that refused to stay straight. The tape curved toward the glow without shifting position. Command spoke with sleeves figuratively rolled. Proceed under observation. Collect a sample if possible. The questions, observe what, collect what, remained behind the teeth. An engineer unrolled a foil bag and reached again. The glow leaned away as if declining a handshake. The first sound to fail was the wind. It did not stop, it simply ceased to be heard. Boot crunch softened into a dry whisper, and then into the memory of a sound, as if the desert were listening to itself from a distance. When Kaminsky called a halt, the word travelled halfway and folded neatly, its end tucked under like a sheet corner. The men counted their own breathing and found it matched a pulse with no visible source. On the recorder, later, there would be only a low, regular static. Headlights crested the rim and dimmed themselves on the sand. White suits stepped down, careful, carrying equipment that looked precise and a little embarrassed to be outdoors. They used phrases that helped no one. Localized inversion, photothermal variance, a field behaving as if it remembered heat rather than made it. The soldiers nodded to keep the world stitched while someone handled the thread. The scientists asked for silence and listened until the silence seemed to listen back. A containment chamber was placed where the pulses were most patient. The glow did not enter. It folded inward, like a hand closing on something already held. The temperature fell without chill, an absence not hostile, only attentive. Someone said it felt like standing inside a photograph. The moment pressed flat, but still breathing. They tried again, and each attempt to capture the light made it smaller by the width of a spoken word. When it was gone, the bowl remained. The sand wore a brightness too shy to be called light. They waited, and on cue, nothing happened. This is how endings arrive where reports outrank memories. Kaminsky wrote what could be written, lines that would travel poorly. The convoy idol grew round again. The wind remembered itself. They took the long last look people take when the world has almost said something, then turned back to the road, carrying a quiet that kept its own time. The trucks climbed gently out of the basin, engines careful not to disturb what might still be listening. Behind them, the sand kept its pale memory, unlit and watchful, as if saving a place for the next question to arrive. They sent the advance team at first light. 5 men stripped to what duty actually needs: water, tools, and a map folded to the right square. Kaminsky walked point, the kind of officer who checked his own knots and trusted the ground to tell him a second truth. The basin looked harmless in daylight, a shallow dish with a rim of limestone and a scatter of scrub that had learned to live with less. Tracks from the night convoy crossed the slope and then faded as if the sand had thought better of remembering them. The men moved without talk, radios low, boots testing their weight the way a carpenter tests a step before trusting the staircase. 10 paces from the rim, they paused. The air had not cooled or warmed, yet it felt denser, like a room where someone had just read a name aloud. Kaminsky lifted his hand, and they waited, arranged in a line that looked like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. He went forward alone and watched the sand brighten by almost nothing, a pale suggestion that did not belong to the sun. It was not a flash or a flare, it was remembering. The glow returned as if it had simply stepped into another room for a moment and then come back without apology. It spread the way calm spreads, outward and level, taking up the basin's shape as if poured. There was no smell of heated stone, no sound of grit shifting under stress. The men expected warmth and found none. One of them said he could hear his pulse more clearly than the wind. They approached in measured steps until the grains at their boots lifted and settled without wind, like a tide practicing on dry land. The light did not glare. It persisted. Instruments performed and then refused. The thermistors returned zeros, the kind that look neat and honest but feel wrong in the mouth. A rangefinder tried to grab the bright edge and return numbers that slid like fish through a net. The corporal put a glove into the boundary and felt nothing at all, which is not the same as cold. The glow eased back by a finger's width, not retreating, not advancing, simply adjusting itself the way a listener adjusts a chair. Kaminsky wrote a line that he did not like but could not discard: behaves like attention. They set a perimeter wider than the night team had drawn and watched the coloured tape curve toward the centre without moving in the sand. Boots stepped into the luminous zone and left no imprint. The surface yielded as usual, and then arranged itself as if the step had not happened. A polite erasure that suggested the ground preferred its original idea. The men looked at one another, not to steady nerves, but to verify that reality had edited itself with a light hand. Feels like standing inside a memory, Kaminsky said. And nobody laughed because the words fit the weather. They took photographs, the practical kind soldiers make when they need proof that the odd hour existed. On the screens the figures looked normal until the eye began to search for the familiar stripe of shade. There was none. The men cast no shadows. Arms lifted to test the rule, a rifle held across the chest, a hand raised between sun and fabric. No bar of darkness formed. Light admitted their presence without offering the old bargain of contrast. The mind reached for a rule and found it had been politely excused from duty. Heat was tried again, this time with a probe pushed into the glow at knee height. The readout fell below freezing while the air felt like regular morning. Breath plumed white at the edge and vanished inside, not condensing, just declining to exist. The corporal, practical and stubborn, slid his gloved palm farther. The glove turned black. It did not scorch or crisp. It became matte, as if brightness had been unstitched from it. He flexed his fingers and felt nothing different. When he withdrew, the glove remained dark, not sticky, not abraded, simply amended. Command asked for a live sample with a voice trimmed to the procedural bone. The request sounded reasonable in the way bridges look reasonable on a map. They assembled a small vacuum vessel and checked the seals by habit, born from other hazards. Kaminsky nodded once, and the corporal advanced it like a cup toward a spring. The glow permitted closeness, then eased back an inch, then another, maintaining a polite distance that never felt like fear. The vessel's mouth touched where the light was most patient. The glow thinned without dimming, like a lake deciding to become a river. They drew in air that their gauges would later describe and that their eyes would mistrust. They tried again with a wider mouth. The field declined more quickly, keeping a constant arm's length of emptiness between itself and capture. A tripod crossed the basin and offered the same lesson. The camera, the barrel, the men themselves made no shadow on sand that remained perfectly visible. The footage would play later, as if manners had been revised. The soldiers did not discuss it. They simply stood a little differently, the way people do when they understand they are being observed kindly by something that will not explain itself. By noon, the basin looked as it had at dawn. Calm, full of choices it had not revealed. The advance team stepped away in small increments, careful not to teach the ground anything new. Radios resumed their ordinary reach. The flags straightened into themselves. A breeze returned and remembered how to be heard. When they looked back from the rim, the pale circle still rested there, present the way recollection is present. No weight, only certainty. Kaminsky tucked his notebook into his vest, as if putting a thought to bed. He told the driver to hold the engine at an idle that felt respectful. They left the perimeter in place and the cameras running, a quiet ring of attention set to measure what would not be owned. The men climbed into the shade under the truck and let canteens answer simple questions. No one tried for new conclusions. They waited with the patience soldiers learn from roads. Somewhere beyond the rim, the lab convoy would already be tracing their dust with stricter words. The team watched the light breathe like tide and let the day keep its voice. When command asked for updates, Kaminsky's report was calm and exact. Phenomenon stable, responsive to approach, non-thermal, sub-zero interior. No retention on sampling. Absence of shadows confirmed. He ended with a line he did not explain. Behavior suggests listening. Then he set the handset down and studied the basin again, as if a softer kind of answer might rise if given time, and the air, cooling just a little, agreed to wait with him. The scientists arrived just before dusk, in vehicles the color of sand and secrecy. Their white suits flashed under the dying sun like misplaced ghosts, each one carrying a case marked with warnings that felt like apologies. They spoke in small words, wrapped in larger ones. Localized photothermal inversion, spectral anomaly, transient field. Phrases that sounded as if meaning itself were under quarantine. Kaminsky and his men stood back, silent observers now, their rifles slung loosely, their faces expressionless in the glow. They watched the newcomers plant tripods and calibrate devices as though the light were a patient, and the desert a room being prepared for surgery. The scientists worked deliberately, every movement slowed by care. Each step closer to the phenomenon met resistance that was not physical but behavioral. Machines stopped responding, thermometers froze, microphones picked up only the faint rhythm of their own static. The lead physicist, a tired man with the look of someone who had stopped believing in complete explanations, held up his recorder and spoke gently, as if to a living thing. "Do you hear that?" he asked. No one answered. But beneath the static, buried low and uneven, a faint echo stirred. It sounded like a voice half dissolved by distance, repeating coordinates that hadn't been spoken in years. Kaminsky recognized them, positions lost from another patrol, long buried in another desert. The men looked to him, but he said nothing. The recording continued its whisper, crackling with the same calm insistence as breath. The physicist listened again and closed the recorder as one does a prayer book. "It's just reflection," he said, not quite believing it. Yet the phrase, reflection, stayed in Kaminsky's mind like a fragment of glass, because the light ahead of them was not reflecting anything. It was producing itself, a self-contained idea, like memory remembering itself without help. The suits advanced to within 10 meters, establishing what they called the first entry protocol. A sensor pod was placed just inside the edge, its metal casing instantly frosting over. Ice bloomed outward in delicate white veins, spreading along its surface in patterns too deliberate to be random. One scientist whispered that it looked like handwriting, and another told him to stop talking. Kaminsky's men watched from the perimeter, the air heavy with that strange absence of warmth. The glow pulsed again, not with color, but with intention. Radios crackled briefly, then went dead as though embarrassed by their own noise. When the commander called out to adjust the perimeter, his words were eaten by the air. They saw his lips move, his hand gesture, but nothing followed. The sound didn't echo or fade. It simply ended, unfinished, leaving silence to occupy the rest of the space. It felt wrong in the way dreams feel wrong after waking. The world still familiar, but every rule rewritten quietly overnight. A soldier tested his own voice and heard it return only halfway, as if the other half had been borrowed. One by one they spoke short words. Here, now, listen. And each one dissolved before reaching the edge of the light. Inside the phenomenon, even the act of speaking seemed to lose meaning, replaced by a growing vibration that settled into their bones. Their own hearts began to sink to it, slow and even. The desert was silent, but they could feel its rhythm pressing faintly against the skin. The scientists took readings that made no sense. Inverse temperatures, oscillating frequencies, a total absence of thermal radiation in the middle of visible brightness. It was the wrong kind of light, cold, articulate, self-sustaining. It didn't illuminate objects, it defined them by absence. Kaminsky described it later as a lantern that remembers the dark. Time lost shape. Watches kept ticking, but the intervals between each sound seemed to stretch or fold. When the team tried to record video, frames stuttered out of sequence. In one playback, a soldier appeared standing still, but the next moment, his reflection in a nearby lens moved a second earlier. The air shimmered faintly, as if the present were bending to accommodate something that had arrived late. As the evening deepened, the scientists attempted extraction. A containment chamber, chrome bright, temperature-proof, was rolled toward the center on mechanical wheels. The glow allowed it to approach, indifferent at first, until the chamber's reflection appeared within its surface. The reflected light rippled like disturbed water, and for a moment the entire field drew in upon itself. The phenomenon inhaled, if such a word could be used for light. The temperature fell again, a soft lurch downward that made the men exhale steam. Kaminsky noted that the breath, too, was absorbed before it could drift away. The chamber sealed over the glowing heart of the basin, and for several seconds, everything held perfectly still. The glow pressed against its transparent walls, then folded inward, curling like smoke into a single point. It winked out, gone, cleanly, without drama. Relief broke through the line, quiet but visible. The scientists began their readings, and for a moment, it looked like the day might end with a conclusion. But the sand beneath the chamber began to glow again, faint and steady, spreading from the bottom upward as though the fire had chosen a different direction to burn. The instruments flickered. One of the scientists reached down to steady the tripod and froze. His hand trembled not from cold, but from an invisible resistance, like pushing through a dream that refused to let him pass. He withdrew it and stared at his glove, now colorless and soft as paper. "It's still burning," Kaminsky said quietly. "Just not here." The phrase stayed. They repeated it later in their reports, in their whispers, in the long silences that followed the debriefs. Whatever the light had been, it was gone, but not extinguished. Retreated, perhaps, to a depth below measuring. The chamber was sealed, tagged, and stored. The scientists packed their gear with the numb precision of people who know their data has outgrown understanding. Night took the basin back, piece by piece. The cold deepened. The glow beneath the sand dimmed to the color of old bone. Kaminsky stood at the rim, notebook in hand, watching the last traces fade. The trucks were ready, engines humming softly. He hesitated before climbing in, as though waiting for permission from something unseen. The silence was not hostile. It was simply full, as if the world had decided to listen again after a long interruption. As they left, the desert seemed unchanged, flat, indifferent, eternal. But in the rearview mirror, for an instant, the reflection of the headlights bent upward, curling like smoke that refused to rise. It was small, faint, almost beautiful. The men said nothing. Kaminsky closed his notebook on the final line he had written. Phenomenon demonstrated awareness. Then he looked at the horizon and thought, not of danger or discovery, but of warmth that had once existed, and now, quietly, did not. The convoy moved east, engines low, carrying with it the first sealed sample of something that could not be weighed. Behind them, the basin settled into silence once more. The sand cooled, the stars returned, and for a few seconds, the ground pulsed faintly, like a heart content to beat unheard. By the time the convoy returned to base, the night had already sealed its version of events. The desert behind them carried no marks, no memory, only the calm geometry of sand shaped by a patient wind. Inside the vehicles, no one spoke. The canisters that held their captured samples were cold to the touch, But when the engineers checked them under light, the interiors looked empty. Just air, or maybe the memory of it. The journey felt longer on return, as if the road itself was unwilling to accept that the event was over. When they crossed the perimeter wire, the base looked unchanged, rows of white prefab offices, antennas tilted like flowers toward the horizon. Yet everything about the air felt slightly off, the way a room feels after someone has rearranged it while you slept. Kaminsky's men disembarked under the floodlights, turning in their weapons, logging their coordinates, trying to resume the choreography of normal life. The officers in charge offered brief nods and shorter words. Report in the morning, debrief at 0900, but the next morning the records were gone. The logs, the temperature charts, the audio tapes, all replaced by blank pages in folders that still smelled of ink. The clerk responsible swore he'd filed them. When he opened the cabinet again, every envelope was empty. The carbon copies had faded to clean grey. The backup drives produced errors that read no data in sector. Kaminsky tried to shrug it off as bureaucracy's natural decay, but there was an unease that didn't fit any regulation. Later, over coffee in the mess hall, one of the engineers leaned close and whispered, "It's like it never happened." His voice wasn't fearful. It was analytical, as though describing a weather pattern. Another replied that even the base logs showed no convoy movement, no fuel draw, no change in head count. The entire mission, on paper, had evaporated. Command issued no reprimands. Silence, it seemed, was procedure. That night, Kaminsky couldn't sleep. His quarters were cold even with the heater on. He walked to the mirror and held his hand under the lamplight. The same glove that had touched the edge of the phenomenon. The skin beneath it looked normal, maybe paler, but his palm carried a faint pulse that wasn't his. He pressed it flat against the glass. The mirror didn't fog. He tried again. The reflection was late by half a heartbeat. In the medical tent, the unit doctor made notes with the calm of habit. Fatigue, possible exposure to experimental coolant. He ordered rest and vitamins. When Kaminsky asked about the missing files, the doctor's tone changed. "You weren't on a field mission," he said, flipping through an empty folder. "It says here you were on perimeter maintenance." The phrase landed softly, but its weight was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, had rewritten his place in time. A week passed. Men from other departments began asking quiet questions in the corridor. Had there been an unscheduled sortie? Had they been near an old weapons range? Each time, Kaminsky answered with the same stillness. No heat, no sound, no shadow. It became a kind of mantra, the only way to keep the memory from fraying. Then came the illness, subtle, persistent. The men who had stood closest to the basin complained of fatigue first, then insomnia, then something stranger. The inability to feel warmth, not the chill of fever or the numbness of frostbite, just an even absence. Blankets did nothing. Coffee steamed without comfort. Some described hearing faint heartbeats in the walls when they tried to sleep. A slow, steady rhythm that matched their own for a while, then drifted slightly out of sync. Medical officers tested for radiation, infection, psychological stress. Results returned clean. The phenomenon, officially, had never existed. Yet whatever it was had followed them quietly, like static that refuses to leave a channel. Kaminsky began keeping his own notes again, handwriting neat and careful, as though order itself might keep the unknown at bay. He recorded every hour of wakefulness, every lapse of warmth, every shadow that didn't quite behave. His sketches filled the margins, circles within circles, fading rings like echoes drawn in graphite. Under infrared light, some of the pencil marks shimmered faintly, as though the paper remembered what it had seen. The medical division scheduled psychological evaluations. The sessions were brief and polite, the kind that ask everything except the right question. Kaminsky described the event in measured detail. The glow, the silence, the way words had refused to travel. The psychologist nodded, noting subject demonstrates detached affect. When he mentioned hearing old radio calls from dead soldiers, the pen slowed, then stopped. Memory conflation, the doctor said softly, as if the diagnosis were a blessing. Weeks later, one of the scientists who'd worked alongside them requested a transfer. Another disappeared entirely. A memo circulated that the Atmospheric Research Division had been reorganized. The phrase reassigned to Project B appeared frequently, meaning nothing, explaining everything. The canister that had once held the glow was shipped out under diplomatic cover. No manifest followed it. Months after the mission, a classified summary was leaked into the base rumor mill. Phenomenon terminated. Cause: instrument malfunction. The language was precise, sterile, absolute, yet a single line at the bottom contradicted everything above it. Phenomenon persists beneath surface. No one could trace who added it. It was neither stamped nor signed. It looked handwritten, a neat italic note in blue ink that hadn't existed anywhere else in the file. Kaminsky read that line many times, running his thumb over it as if testing its weight. The words had no author but carried conviction, beneath surface. He began to dream of that phrase. Sand folding over itself, the glow pressing gently upward from beneath, as though waiting for permission to return. In the months that followed, the men drifted into new assignments. Files vanished as quickly as they were opened. The story of Operation Silent Flame shrank to a rumor, and then even that was taken away. When Kaminsky was finally rotated home, his departure papers listed him as non-deployed. He carried no commendations, no records, just a quiet understanding that the things which burn without heat also fade without evidence. Yet on the night before his flight, he sat alone outside the barracks, the air thick with the scent of dust and diesel. The stars were unusually bright, their light sharp but cool. For a moment, he thought he saw the horizon lift. A faint, pulsing whiteness, distant and low, almost like memory deciding to take form again. He blinked, and it was gone. Perhaps it had never been there. Inside, the base generator hummed softly, the only sound allowed to exist. Somewhere in the distance, a radio clicked once, caught a fragment of static, and then fell silent. Kaminsky closed his eyes, and for the first time since the basin, he felt something close to warmth, not from the air or the ground, but from the realization that silence itself could keep a promise. The next morning, his quarters were found empty. His papers neatly arranged, his bed unwrinkled. The logbook on his desk was blank except for one line, written in small, deliberate script. It never stopped burning. It just learned to do so quietly. The wind carried no answer, only sand moving where footsteps should have been. Somewhere beyond the fence line, the desert exhaled, and for a second, the sunlight dimmed, not darker, just thinner, as if sharing itself with something beneath the surface, still awake, still remembering. Years passed before anyone spoke of the basin again. The maps changed, the borders shifted, the base was renamed twice, and still the desert kept its silence. But silence is never perfect. It leaks, it hums, it remembers. The first civilian report came from a long-haul truck driver who crossed the northern road at night. He told a radio station in Aleppo that the sand had lit up beneath his tires, white, pure, brief, like lightning deciding to take its time. The call went viral for a week before being buried under newer wars, but the coordinates he gave matched Kaminsky's last known entry almost exactly. Months later, a geologist from a humanitarian group took drone footage of the same region. The camera captured faint circles glowing in the dark, perfectly symmetrical, cold and noiseless. They would flare for seconds and vanish before the sensor could fix their temperature. The report described them as bioluminescent dust activity, a theory no one believed but no one disproved. The footage was quietly removed from public archives, cited as corrupted, yet fragments of it survived, pixels of white scattered like memory, trying to recall itself. Local shepherds began calling it the cold fire. They said it appeared on nights when the wind stopped moving, forming rings that shimmered low to the ground. Some claimed it was where lost travelers returned to remember their names before disappearing again. In nearby villages, people whispered that touching the light left your shadow behind. No one could prove it, and no one wanted to. The legend settled softly, like sand over glass. By 2003, the story had crossed borders in digital form. A low-resolution clip surfaced on a forgotten message board. A reel-to-reel recording allegedly found in an abandoned storage locker near Krakow. The label on the box read simply, Field Audio, 1968, OSF. Listeners described a steady male voice, patient and weary, reading coordinates, then pausing. The voice identified itself as Lieutenant Kaminsky. The tape lasted only 7 minutes. For most of it, the voice described what sounded like a place rather than an event. The fire does not burn, Kaminsky said. It remembers what has already burned. He spoke calmly, without fear, describing the light as a threshold, not a thing. At one point, he mentioned hearing breathing, not wind, not us, something slower. Near the end, the tape filled with silence, but when audio engineers later enhanced it, they detected a faint rhythm beneath the noise, 72 beats per minute, steady, human. The discovery drew interest from the fringes of academia, physicists, folklorists, psychologists, each convinced it explained their own theories. Some said it was an echo of seismic resonance, others a hallucination recorded on magnetized tape. None agreed on what it meant, yet all were drawn to the idea that something could exist without needing to happen again. The scientists who analyzed the heartbeat found no splicing, no edits. If this is a fabrication, one said, it was made by someone who understood how to lie with sincerity. The file circulated quietly online, usually vanishing within hours of reposting. Listeners described strange after-effects, a brief ringing in the ears, a drop in body temperature, an inability to recall the last sentence spoken before pressing play. One forum user wrote that they'd played the recording on loop through the night and woke to find the air around their speakers cooler by several degrees. Another claimed the heartbeat aligned perfectly with their own until the tape ended. Then theirs skipped a beat. In the years that followed, more witnesses emerged. A French satellite technician claimed to have detected cold anomalies moving eastward through the desert every spring. An Afghan journalist filmed glowing sand blowing through her camp at night. The particles stuck to her notebook, forming letters that faded by dawn. Her report never aired, but the still frames circulated quietly among researchers who'd studied unexplained luminescence. Each case was dismissed, yet each bore the same signature: light without heat, brightness without sound. Even governments began to acknowledge something, though never by name. A declassified memo from 1999 referenced a persistent energy pattern in the Syrian frontier and recommended non-interference due to unstable quantum morphology. It read less like science and more like surrender. Somewhere, buried in another language, Operation Silent Flame had kept burning in bureaucratic translation. The legend evolved. Soldiers who served nearby decades later spoke of dreams, standing in pale sand, hearing voices that weren't orders but recollections. They would wake with frost on their lips in desert summer. One intelligence officer who collected these accounts wrote in his private notebook, "If light can remember, maybe war never ends, maybe it just cools down enough to listen." In 2018, a research drone from an environmental agency recorded one final burst over the same coordinates. 11 seconds long, perfectly circular, visible on multiple spectrums, but thermally inert. The pilot watching through the screen described feeling a warmth on his face while the sensors showed nothing. He smiled as he watched it fade, though later he couldn't explain why. The recording's metadata showed an internal clock anomaly. The timecode lost 1 second in the middle of the sequence. As if even measurement hesitated, the footage, now buried in archives, carries no commentary, only a faint hum picked up by the drone's microphone, a sound that matches a human heartbeat at 72 beats per minute. It fades naturally, no glitch, no cut, just a quiet ending. People still drive that road, mostly truckers and aid convoys. Sometimes, when the night is cold enough, headlights catch something pale on the horizon. A shimmer, a blush of light that vanishes before the mind can confirm it. They don't stop. They don't report it. The world moves on, but the sand does not. It remembers everything it was told. And sometimes, when the wind is perfectly still, locals say you can stand at the rim of that basin and feel the faintest pulse under your boots. Like the ground itself inhaling quietly, waiting for memory to finish breathing. In every language, fire has always meant the same thing: beginning and end, warmth and warning, creation wrapped in destruction. Yet what the soldiers saw in that silent basin refused all definitions. It did not consume, it did not feed. It simply was. A perfect contradiction that left everything unchanged, yet quietly rearranged. Perhaps that was its message. That not all burning requires heat, and not all endings must be loud. When the last reports faded, and the last witnesses grew old or vanished, the phenomenon became a rumor too fragile for science and too patient for myth. Some said it was a mirror. The desert remembering every flame that had ever scarred its horizon and replaying them in peace. Others believed it was the world itself, practicing the act of letting go, showing that memory can exist without pain if held gently enough. The desert, after all, knows how to listen. It carries every footprint for a while, then folds them back into itself with care. It remembers the brightness but forgets the noise. In that way, Operation Silent Flame was never an experiment or an accident. It was a lesson, written in a language of light too quiet for measurement. For Kaminsky, wherever he ended up, Perhaps the meaning revealed itself not in discovery but in acceptance. To stand before something that neither harms nor helps, that neither explains nor hides, is to understand the simplest truth of existence, that not everything in the world is meant to serve us. Some things are simply meant to be witnessed. And so, the fire that burned without heat endures, not in laboratories or archives, but in the slow breath of the land, in the hush that follows every act of remembrance. Those who have seen it say that the silence it leaves behind feels almost human, like the pause between thoughts before memory decides which parts to keep. Maybe that's all fire ever was. Not destruction, but the brief light that shows us what still remains. The night settles back over the basin. The sand lies untroubled, the stars indifferent yet attentive. Somewhere beneath the surface, the light waits, gentle and endless, teaching the earth how to remember without pain.